Oh, hang on. Oh, that's a shame. Let's get started.
Another race for the world's greatest driver, Juan Manuel Fangio.
Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead. That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And James Hunt is the world champion by just one single point.
By being a racing driver, you are under risks all the time. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
And that is Michael Schumacher ahead, the world champion.
To become a four-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel. Lewis Hamilton, champion of the world.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
Max Verstappen is champion of the world.
Oh my God! Max Verstappen, you are the world champion! The world champion!
Hello and welcome to episode 12 of F1 in Review 2023. I'm Tom Clabon, and as ever I'm joined by Tristan Fancourt and Angus Gallager. Today we're looking back at the Miami Grand Prix, where, who would have guessed it, Red Bull finished in a 1-2 position come the end of this weekend. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, no. Well, Perez qualified in P1, Verstappen qualified in P9. That's after Leclerc's crash meant that Q3 came to a premature end, a topic we'll get onto later. And now Verstappen, he started on the hard tyres, tore through the pack quite quickly, overtook his teammate, sealed the win. Without being too dramatic, I think it's fair to say the Dutchman was more than flying this Sunday, don't you think?
He was flying this Sunday. The Flying Dutchman, very nice, Tom. I liked that. Throwing a bit of ye old stories into there. And I think it was a story of two halves this weekend. On one hand, we had an optimistic beginning with Perez's good fortunes allowing him to get pole position, and then by the end of the race it was clear that Perez was struggling a bit and Max just had consistency. And I think it would be good if we can start off with the leading controversy this weekend, which was this rumour, I think, it was started by Anthony Davidson on Sky F1, that Perez's lack of success and Max's win came off the back of Red Bull screwing one driver over, and specifically Checo, by not giving him the numbers. Live on their commentary, Anthony Davidson said that his Perez's engineer wasn't giving him the delta, the time between him and Max, and therefore he wasn't necessarily pushing as hard as he needed to, which meant that Max came out of the pit stop on the much newer medium tyres, only 2 seconds behind him, and breezed past him. And what an interesting narrative, an exciting narrative that is. Unfortunately, it's just an absolute lie, and there's no other word for it. He just lied. That's not what happened at all. In fact, Checo's engineer was giving him not only Max's average lap time, his lap time. He was also saying how far Max would be when he came out of the pit stop behind him. And so Checo was getting that data. He knew that it was 17 seconds to Max, it was 16 seconds to Max, and that was something Christian Horner confirmed on the radio. But it seems like this is something that's still emanated out and is being thrown across the social media verse, and it's just nonsense. And I think that's important because if you look at also Checo's own discussion about this, he said that he just wasn't as fast. It was kind of like a role reversal from the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, right? When Max said he just wasn't as fast as Perez, this weekend Perez said, well, I wasn't really as fast as Max. I couldn't get the car set up. And so it feels a bit like an inverse of what we saw last weekend when the luck favoured Perez and Perez ended up winning, and this time Perez wasn't able to capitalise on the luck, and Max just had in the end a better strategy. So I think it's a real reflection, I think, on what we're hearing in the commentary. And to be honest, I feel like I was let down by Sky a little bit and the commentary for just lying like that. I'm not totally sure why they would do that, other than to get people frothing at the mouth, getting angry, and creating a better narrative, would you say?
Agreed.
Yeah, that's fair. A narrative to suit what they wanted, the view that they wanted to portray, because in reality, I think, for me, the standout thing from this weekend is just Verstappen's pretty good, isn't he? He's not a bad driver. Because he was dominating that weekend up to the stage of Q3, where he made that mistake on his opening lap, put himself in a position where it's not impossible to get a pole with one timed lap. Like, it is possible. It just puts you in a tricky position, especially if a red flag appears. And lo and behold, a red flag appeared because of Charles Leclerc's erroneous driving around the turn 6 and 7 area. But despite that, Verstappen just picked them off one by one. Didn't even need the benefit of a safety car and everything, because we had the unusual distinction of a race with 0 retirements, and he just kept on going, picking them off. Had the faster car, got past Perez. I remember after our podcast last week, or during our podcast, we were talking about, is this Verstappen having a challenge to him? Is this Perez in the title fight fully? Well, he may well still be. I think he's done very well to be getting to this point and be considered for it. But I think Verstappen it's the classic person at the top of the sport, the top of their game, has a slower start than you'd expect, and they just go, right, okay, it's fine, I've got it, it's under control, I'll show you what I'm made of. And they put down a performance like that, which just underlines their superiority. And I think that just simply is what Verstappen has right now, is just superiority. So I think that should be the main thing to take away from the weekend, not whether or not Red Bull were being biased towards Verstappen in the eyes of Sky Sports. So I think that just Verstappen just showed his class, really, and he's quite good. He's quite good, isn't he?
Yeah, he's just set the bar really, really high this weekend, as he's done in many Grand Prix before this season, last season, and the season before, really. And it shows just how good Perez has to be every single week to get close to him, because, yes, he did make one or two mistakes. There was that costly one towards the end where he gave away a second plus, I believe. But if we rewind before that, he was putting in lots of fast laps, had a good start as well, not normally his strong suit, and he was boxed in by the fact he had to be on the mediums to get that stronger start. Meanwhile, Verstappen had more of a free hand, if you will. So he's been unlucky to a point, but then again, when you're up against, dare I say, one of, if not the best drivers of this generation coming up, then it's very, very difficult to do anything but come second. But I think Christian Horner made a very good point, really, when he said afterwards, quite smugly in my head, but still, where was Mercedes, where was Ferrari, where was Aston Martin for that matter? Because at the moment it's only Fernando Alonso who's putting some form of a fight towards either the Red Bulls. Stroll's nowhere to be seen, no doubt we'll talk about that now and before the end of the season. But he's the only one trying to give them a fight. But as I say, Mercedes and Ferrari, unhampered by any form of a penalty, are nowhere near Red Bull, and it is now up to Perez having to literally have the best season of his life, 10 out of 10, if not 9.5 out of 10 every single race, to go and even give himself or anybody else a chance of beating Verstappen, really. But going back to the first point before handing over again, a real shame that Sky were peddling a false narrative, because it's not an unbelievable one, because we know that who the number one driver is. But, fueling something like this based on nothing is, well, it's wrong, put it that way.
It is wrong, and it is something that we have to deal with, which is why I thought we should get it out of the way to begin with, so that if you are only tuning into the first 6 or 7 minutes of this podcast, then you can go away feeling much more content with the life, knowing that Perez is not necessarily being, rolled over by Red Bull and thrown into the back of the van a little bit there. And here's a question for you, though. Reflecting on this race, would you say that we have still have a title fight at Tom because of what your comments were last year? Or would you say that perhaps we're now moving on to the point where we're at Max Verstappen versus Max Verstappen's bad luck?
I think there still is a fight going on. Going back to my comments last episode, I still think that Verstappen will win this, but I think that Perez will give him a good run for his money to a point. A better run for his money than Bottas gave Hamilton in the sort of Mercedes-dominated time. But it does depend on how Perez does and the tracks that don't suit him. Looking at somewhere like Spain, Monaco, you expect him to do well. Hungary as well, but getting onto streets like getting onto tracks, like the British Grand Prix, Silverstone, for example, somewhere like the Japanese Grand Prix as well, Monza. Just a few examples about where in the past Perez hasn't really been at the top of his game compared to others. So there is a fight, but I don't think anyone's kidding themselves when they say it's a serious fight akin to even last year or the season before.
Is the fight still on? What did I say last week? Did I say that it's not? Or did I think I might have said that it's on.
What's your gut saying this week?
Yeah.
I think. Well, I mean, I think last week I said that it's on, but like Verstappen would pull away eventually, like champions do. It wouldn't surprise me if I'd said something pedantic like, well, it's always on mathematically until the very last. I say something like, Nick De Vries and Logan Sargent are only 119 points behind with 18 races to go. They can
it's all to play for.
The fight is on, but like on a serious note, I'd say that like I'd have been more likely to say the fight was on last week because of the way Perez drove, but then this week I'd say that the fight isn't as on because I don't know if that's the thing, because Verstappen did such a masterclass. But that just perhaps shows it's more of a fickle decision I'm making. It's me only really judging it based on each race. I mean, we could be sitting here after Imola and Perez has wiped the floor with everyone and Verstappen has crashed out, and we say, oh, Verstappen's lost his mind, Perez is the favourite. So it's a bit fickle really, but I think in the long term it's still at least there's a fight for the drivers. The Constructors' Championship is like done and dusted already. Red Bull got twice as many points as anyone. There's only Red Bull are on 224 points, and there's only one other team who are on a 3-figure amount of points. So that's done and dusted. But at least there's some element of a fight in the drivers, even if Verstappen is. I still say you still definitely get short odds on him at the bookmakers.
What do you think, Tristan?
Well, I was sceptical last week, and I questioned you a little bit, and I still do, unfortunately, Tom, because I just think what Max executed this weekend was an absolute masterclass of a drive. It brought back memories of Brazil 2021 with Lewis Hamilton and his ability to go from the back of the grid to the front and winning. Amazing. Absolutely nuts performance then. And from Max this weekend, just watching him pick off the drivers one by one. Before the race, Alonso was asked to predict again, because he successfully did it in Azerbaijan, what lap Max Verstappen would overtake him. And he said 25. I think it'd be 25. It was 12. Absolutely insane performance. There was no one could do anything. I was thinking, well, perhaps Max would be held back a bit by the other drivers. Nope, no chance. Everyone was fighting a different race. It was like Max Verstappen was in Formula 1 and everyone else was in Formula 1.5, Formula 2. Apart from, you could say, maybe apart from Perez, but even then, Max's lap times on his only set of hards, because he went hards until the 15 laps before the end, so lap 50 or 52, whatever it was, he kept putting in fastest laps on these old tyres, so no one had an answer for him. But what I'm interested in now is what does this mean actually for the F1 fans, because this weekend was definitely a bit of an experiment. America often is for Formula 1, because it's a time when they get to crack out what I would class as the over-the-top. I think it's cringy. I appreciate that your personal preferences out there, your sensitivities may mean that you don't find it cringy, but I find a lot of the US stuff very, very cringy. I found the introduction cringy and excessive. Now, you might not. Fair enough. Good on you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. But there's no doubt, and I think we can all agree, that Formula 1 has attracted more fans in the last few years, and certainly many more fans since 2021. Do you see those fans sticking around?
Maybe taking a hiatus, I'd say. Keeping a more casual eye on Formula One, being more subscribers or viewers of Drive to Survive than I'd say probably weekend to weekend content.
I mean, it's the Netflix generation, so that they won't have much attention span if things start to go wrong and things don't seem as exciting. But I like to think that maybe you'll stick around because, like, they've at least joined recently, and the character. I think the characters in the sport will be more relevant to what they feel. They'd be more sort of feel more sort of in tune with or sort of related. Feel like the drivers are more relatable per se. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what their staying power is. Definitely.
I don't know. I'm skeptical. There was a lot of, I think, frustrating comments around this weekend, and certainly an annoyance at the fact that we are back to the 2015, 2017, 2018, sort of era. I mean, you might say this is kind of like 2016 2.0 Hamilton versus Rosberg, but the point is we're in ultra dominance, and I think for a lot of fans they haven't seen this. 2021 was a bit of a title fight. 2020 was a little bit more exciting because we had sort of the rise of Max, the prequels, if you like, to 2021. Max Strikes Back, and now we have certainly settled into the next age, and then Max's dominant era. And I feel like this is something that people won't be prepared for. And especially if you haven't yet adopted what I would say is a holistic view of Formula One. I think if you're just watching because you're excited about who's going to win the race, I think you're going to get very bored very quickly. If you are listening to this and you are new to Formula One, my suggestion is that you get excited about the points and just what the points mean. For me, and I think perhaps for you guys as well, when we saw George Russell get his first point, it was as exciting as perhaps winning the World Championship, because these things mean a lot. But I do feel like that understanding of what's quite exciting about the sport hasn't necessarily trickled down yet, and I think Formula One's gonna have a problem, because I think they are trying lots of these new things for these new fans, and they're great. Yeah, I like the fact we're trying new things, but on the other hand, the show, the actual spectacle, needs to come from the driving, the racing, the excitement, wheel-to-wheel action. And they're just not delivering on that. It would be like watching the Super Bowl only for the halftime show. Well, yes, certainly we can all do that, but you would have thought you'd want the actual main event to be equaling it.
Yeah, and I take your point about the battle for third, fourth, people getting points that haven't got points before, and that being exciting and important, and I subscribe to that entirely. But it is settling, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, we all do go and watch the sport about who's going to go and win it, who's going to get on the podium, and that's why I think that even last year was quite exciting, because you had two constructors who could win, two constructors who were literally gunning for P1, P2, P3 on merit. Granted, there was one team, Ferrari, who, let's say, put constraints on themselves and ultimately were the masters of their own downfall. But there were two constructors that could do something week in, week out. There was a bit of jeopardy in there, but at the moment, there is no jeopardy. And speaking as an F1 fan, I am frustrated again, because I feel we're going back into that Mercedes dominant period where it's looking back at who's going to get fourth, who's going to get fifth, who's going to go and score points, which is fine, but it is settling, really. I don't think that's why anybody got involved in the sport to start with, but maybe that's just me. It
does get a bit repetitive when you have the same podium combination being repeated over and over again. We've had the days of what would be seen on the graphics as Ham Ver Bot, otherwise known as Hamilton Verstappen Bottas, and now we're getting Ver per Allo, so Verstappen Perez Allo, Verstappen Perez Alonso. And whilst it's fair to recognise both the superiority, F1 is a meritocracy, sure, so being able to acknowledge excellence and when a team's done a good job. That's what Toto Wolff said last year. He said F1's a meritocracy. In the years when we produced the fastest car, I expected people to say well done, so I'll say well done to the Red Bull from this year. And again, that's fair. And also, it acknowledges I think, insane nature of a 41-year-old man standing on the podium 4 times in one season. That must be a record, I reckon, surely. Other than maybe the 50s when everyone was in their 40s and 50s. But still, yeah, it does. You're right. It gets repetitive, and I'd just like to see all it takes maybe is one race this season, or a few races where it's more chaotic and you get more jeopardy, like drivers sort of like from the top not doing as well as they should have done, crashing out. Maybe we need a wet race. We haven't had any form, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't had a single drop of rain so far this season. And yes, I know we've been to Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Azerbaijan and Miami, so I'm probably being a bit harsh there, and considering the time of year we're at as well. But something like a wet race, maybe Bernie Ecclestone's idea of introducing sprinklers every 3 races was a good idea after all.
Visionary.
If we're talking about trying new things and radical ideas, then there's one to put in the pipeline possibly. But yeah, I agree with the points about it. I fear that we don't want it going stale. We don't want it going stale, and that each race we turn up and we're like, oh well, I think this person might win again, or I think this person might finish on the podium again. So I think that sometimes seasons happen, right, where it can be more stale and more boring, and like teams do just have more of a dominant edge, like Red Bull does right now. But it's something which you ideally wouldn't want to happen. So, but I wouldn't know what the best way to avoid it is. I guess wait for the regulations to close the field up, as they often do.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And this is why I think Christian Horner rightly said, well, where's everyone else? Because it's not for Red Bull to hold themselves behind. I mean, let's be very honest for a moment. I don't think at any moment during the complete and utter dominating era of Mercedes, after 2014 onwards, Toto Wolff, Lewis Hamilton, and Rosberg/Bottas turned around and said, let's change this. This sucks. They loved it, and that's the problem. And it was for everyone else to get back up to the front. And my solution is perhaps a bit radical, but this is going to be because we chuck everyone down the same pipe. And the regulations are so tight now that there is no room for innovation and unusual innovation anymore. Okay, and I'm going to sound a bit like one of those old farts for a moment that goes, oh, well, look at the olden days. But look at the olden days. We had the Tyrrell 6-wheeler, was it Brabham's fan car? You had experimental aero designs. We had the introduction of, even after that, right, going into the late noughties, we had things like the F-duct, which was an innovation in itself until it got banned. We had the double diffuser on the Brawn car, and how everyone had to copy that. We had these moments of innovation and like unusual things, and that just can't happen anymore. When we look at innovation now, the innovation we see is, oh look, Ferrari have done something weird with their wing mirrors. Oh, Mercedes have done something, added an aero to their wing mirror. But that's going to make a difference, isn't it? There's no room for these innovation. So when you say to people, well, it's still a constructors sort of championship, everyone builds a different car, but you're going to have to sort of have the same design and very, very close. There's going to be one optimum, and that's the problem. There is going to be one optimum. Whereas if you go back a bit and into the, I don't want to say the good old days of racing because it sounds like the cliche, but if you do make it less restrictive, you can have multiple right answers. And that can bring about some exciting championships. And that's I think gonna hamper Formula 1 for a long time. Unless they're willing to make it like Formula 2 or Formula 3 or the W Series or Champion Series, which is everyone has the same car. If you're gonna make everyone have the same car, well, make everyone have the same car then. Because I feel like at the moment, and maybe this is a hot take, we've got the worst of both worlds. we're forcing everyone to almost have the same car, and we're also wasting time by making the pack slowly, transcend across the poor ideas towards that sort of optimum golden standard, which eventually is what we saw in 2021, and eventually gave us a decent fight.
Mm-hmm. Here.
Yeah, that's fair. If you want to know about other funny innovations, you mentioned the the fan car and the ground effect cars and the six-wheeler.
Yep.
Look up about something that happened in the late 90s where teams, I think it was Ferrari and Tyrrell at the time, brought these things called X-Wings, which were basically aerodynamic devices which were just little sort of winglets sticking up off the top of the nose cone, which are promptly banned because I think partly they look ridiculous, but also because if they fell off, they'd knock the driver on the head, and also they didn't actually improve performance, and they looked really funny.
Yeah, there's loads of things like that, and there is a reason why we don't have it anymore. But still, I think that's maybe where this sport needs to go. Maybe start looking at unifying the cars and moving on from the good old days where you could produce a car out of a shed and fight, because that's what Formula One was. And if you look at the original Formula One rules, they are hilarious. It's like, you need to have a minimum of 4 wheels. And I'm not saying that we need, and that's why they get 6 wheels, because there's a minimum. I'm not saying that we need to go back to those days of completely unfettered unregulation. But I am sort of suggesting that if we all admit that we need to go towards one optimum suggestion, then perhaps it needs to move with the times and towards the standard car for everybody, or they roll back a little bit.
And sticking with Ferrari, we're sticking with Charles Leclerc. He crashed twice in the same spot at Miami, once in practice and in Q3. Qualified 7th, finished 7th. He said afterwards, "We have a car that is so incredibly difficult to be on the limits." Now, fun fact for you all, he's crashed more in 5 weeks of this season than Mick Schumacher did for 2 years in Formula One. There's now 10 points between him and Sainz. Sainz on 44, him on 34. Dare I say, is Leclerc all that? Is he a world champion to be, or is he actually falling down in our estimations after a great performance in the weekend just gone at Baku?
I think that I'd take my mind back to a comment I read from BBC Sport over the weekend, which is that it's supposedly a commonly held view in the paddock that Charles Leclerc is probably, and I think this is fair, he's probably the fastest driver in F1 over a single lap. His raw speed is unmatched by anyone, arguably. Maybe Verstappen, but everyone else doesn't come close to him on one lap speed. But it's his mistakes and his pushing to the limit too much that means that he isn't considered amongst the top echelon, the very highest. So you have your Verstappens, your Hamiltons, your Alonsos. He's not quite there. I think that's a fair reflection, to be honest with you. Like, this guy has 19 pole positions in 108 races, and he's never really been in a car, maybe other than 2019, he's never really been in a car which is the fastest on the grid. Okay, compare that to Verstappen, who has 22 pole positions, and he's been in cars which have often been the fastest. So clearly Leclerc has very good natural speed. He got pole in Baku in a car which he has just described as, undrivable and very difficult to control. So clearly he's very quick over one lap. But you're right in that the crashing statistics are quite staggering, and he often pushes it over the limit. And it's not just this year. I mean, I think back to previous examples such as Baku in his first year at Ferrari, when he was class of the field all weekend, but then binned it in Q2 and started 10th or 15th or something. And there are other examples which I can't know off the top of my head right now, but there are other examples of him crash, or even times when, Baku last weekend was on pole, he crashed. In Monaco a couple of years ago, he was on pole and then he crashed and got pole, but then couldn't take part in the race. So he does have a streak, and it's interesting for a driver who he's in his 6th year as a Formula One driver, and he clearly is very fast. But you're right, he makes these mistakes, and they pop up more regularly than you'd perhaps expect. And I still think, don't get me wrong, he's an excellent driver. Behind that group of Verstappen, Hamilton, Alonso, I'd probably place him the top of the tree below that. Maybe I'd say him and Perez, and probably George Russell would be the next three in terms of like actual driving ability. Maybe like stick Lando Norris in there as well, forgetting his the struggles the McLaren has. But yeah, I mean Leclerc, he has this weird tendency to just, for want of a better phrase, bin it in the wall a lot. Considering his immense natural speed and what you think he would be capable of. Do you guys think that he can? Because for me, I like to think that one day, in 3 years' time, maybe we'll sit here and be like, oh, Charles Leclerc, he turned the corner. Like, I always remember someone saying, ironically, about Romain Grosjean back in the day. They said, this guy's got talent and potential because you can't make a consistent driver fast, but you can make a fast driver consistent. And Leclerc clearly is fast. But can he be made more consistent? I've just thought of another one where he crashed. Remember last year in France when he was leading the race? Yep. And if he'd won, he closes that gap to Verstappen, the championship's a bit more interesting, and he crashes out from the lead. But I'd be interested to think, do you guys think that we will look back in a couple of years and think about how he turned a corner and channeled that speed into almost like slightly less speed, but then fewer crashes? What do you think?
I'm not sure. I think if he sticks with Ferrari, he's minimalising his chances of that, really, because couple a driver that's crashing a lot in this season and last season with a team that's not learning from their own mistakes, I fail to go and see a scenario where he's seriously fighting for a world championship while Red Bull are on their game and Mercedes are still asleep. And I'd even go further than that. I'd actually say, this may be a hot take, but reading out signs there, he's leading him by 10 points. He's beaten him already. I'd actually say that Sainz is a better driver than Leclerc, and if anyone's going to win a world championship out of those two, I think it's going to be Sainz, because you rarely see him crash. He's very consistent. He's what you want in a driver, or he has world championship qualities in him. Tenacity, resilience, being dumped from Toro Rosso and the Red Bull Academy, if you will, being dumped by Renault, building himself back up from when it came to McLaren and then going on to Ferrari. I think he's got more characteristics right here, right now, to be a world champion than Leclerc is. Leclerc burst onto the scene with Sauber, got on to Ferrari and was rightly dubbed as being the next big thing, so to speak. But he's flattering to deceive, to put it politely, and I think that Sainz is more of an underdog, and that he's the one who's more likely to turn a corner and pose a serious threat.
I don't know. I think you're being a little bit harsh, because I think the problem we've got at the moment with Leclerc, well, or maybe this is not the problem with Leclerc, is the problem for Leclerc, is there is going to be an expectation that he's got to be challenging Max, and that means pushing the car. That means pushing the car farther than perhaps the car can actually go, and that's a problem. There's an interesting take on this exact problem, right? You actually talked about Romain Grosjean at Haas. Well, oddly enough, Gunther Steiner talks about this, and he has a really interesting perspective on whether or not drivers make a big difference. And he says no driver can make up a deficiency in a car, and that's what they basically have to keep saying to Romain Grosjean. Part of the reason why Grosjean was crashing a lot. And if we apply this here, Leclerc is having to make up the deficiency in the car, and he can't do it. And I think that's something I think that's something that we have to understand as fans. And I think Leclerc needs to understand as a driver. He's taking bigger risks than Max. He's taking more curb, more speed. He's having to push the car beyond what it can do, and that means it's going to end up doing the double spin into the wall a lot. And that ended up being, I think, the downfall for Mick, the downfall for Romain Grosjean, and I think it could be the downfall of Leclerc. Why is Sainz doing better than Leclerc? Probably because Sainz is only challenging where the car is happy to be. I mean, it's depressing, right? That's a really sad thought. But if you're pushing 100% all the time, then you're tempted to take it, I guess, too far, and that's it. You're just going to crash. So no car can make up the deficient. No driver can make up a deficiency in the car, and I think that's Leclerc's problem at the moment.
But when you argue that consistency is a problem, if you were to compare the drivers, looking at the vast array of results so far, granted only 5, you've got Sainz 4.655. Meanwhile, 2 retirements granted for Leclerc, but it ranges from 7th to 3rd.
Well, yes, but if you consider Leclerc's absolute speed, right, on his qualifying lap, he can nail it 100%. If he wanted to repeat that in the race, all the things would have to be the same, right? So he'd need to be on the stickiest tyres, he'd need to be on a low fuel run, and he'd need no one in his way. So this is the problem with qualifying. Okay, so qualifying gives you a very select set of parameters. So the best I can say to answer your question is Leclerc is inconsistent because he can probably get the car around the track faster than anyone in some very specific situations. And then you ask yourself, well, is Perez pushing as hard as they need to? Do you remember the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in 2021? Max
Not really.
is incredible qualifying attempt for pole position. I don't know if you remember that, Angus, and
yes,
we almost watched
classic.
One of the greatest laps ever. And why was Max having to push that hard? He was having to push that hard because Mercedes had the upper hand at that track. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean Max was a bad driver because he nearly put in one of the best performances and ended up hitting the wall just before he crossed the line, which meant that it was, a wasted performance. Doesn't mean say he's inconsistent. It means he's having to push harder than anyone else to get as fast as his rival. And then in the race, Max couldn't keep Lewis behind, and Lewis ended up winning. And I think the problem we've got here is Leclerc is having to try and push that Ferrari further than it's been and can probably go in order to get 2nd or 3rd. And now it's going to come back and bite him because we had particularly windy conditions. As soon as you're out those set parameters, you're going to crash. And I think if he reeled it back and said, look, to be honest, the best I can do is 4th or 5th, everyone will be going, well, hold on a minute, you're Charles Leclerc. You're the champion in the making. You're in a Ferrari. Why are you going for 4th and 5th? Why aren't you going for 1st? So there you go. That's his options, right? You can either be inconsistent but push it to his Ferrari to where we all think Ferrari should be, or he could be more consistent, in which case everyone's going to complain that he is only in 4th or 5th place.
But I suppose if you're him, then you can go and say, well, it's not my fault that I've got, to quote Toto Wolff, an S-box of a car, if you will.
Yeah, and everyone better be really understanding. But do you think Charles would be happy with that? I think as a person, he's going to think, I'm going to push it as far as I possibly can.
Yes, that's an interesting point about I want to refer back to the bit you say about Verstappen and his crash. But the one thing I'd say, I'm sort of in this discussion. I'm not as I say. Tom is on a more sort of scolding viewpoint, whilst Tristan's more Tom's like the bad cop and Tristan's the good cop. And I'm the cop I'm the inexperienced cop who's just still doing work experience or something. Because I'm sort of the view that, like that Verstappen incident, that was a one-off incident. We saw Verstappen not really put a foot wrong in that championship year, other than a couple of things. Maybe he could have left more space at Silverstone, turning in on Hamilton, and yes, maybe he probably had pole at Saudi Arabia, even though that lap was like iconic and like something to behold. And one of the most watched clips of something not being a pole, I'd say, as well. But I think the problem with Leclerc is he does it on a regular basis. He pushes too hard regularly, and he overcooks it regularly, and that's the issue for me. The fact that it's not spread out across a long period of time. It happens on quite a regular basis. He doesn't seem to go many races without some sort of prang or incident occurring. And yes, he could have walked under some scaffolding, or he could have, looked in the mirror, or like what's the other bad, like what is it? Walk over 10 black cats or something like that. But he does seem to get himself into these situations a lot. Now, I wouldn't say that I disagree with Sainz being a better driver or one who might win a world championship. I think that Sainz is good, but I think he's too middle of the road. I think he is very much a Perez type figure in that he's good and he will win races, but will he win a championship? I can't see it myself. Leclerc, in my view, definitely still has a higher ceiling, should we say. But I also don't disagree with the fact that he does it on a regular basis, and it's proving it must be infuriating for Ferrari to an extent because they have such a talented driver, but then he does this on a regular basis. But then at the same time, to throw something else into the mix, this might not be an issue come the end of next year, having based on his comments in the press conference for Azerbaijan last week, where instead of silencing any doubters and putting any speculation to bed and saying, I will drive for Ferrari, he said, there have not been talks with Mercedes. Not yet. So he definitely didn't silence that with the not yet, which could easily, to be fair, be a language barrier or a possible, like, a miscommunication. But at the same time, didn't exactly silence any potential gossip, rumour about perhaps a Russell Leclerc partnership at Mercedes in 2025, which would be that'll be a lovely pairing. Very interesting.
Rip Ocon.
He still has ambitions, doesn't he?
And De Vries.
That would be quite the driver lineup, though, wouldn't it? If you're thinking of a replacement for Lewis Hamilton to come and slot in, granted what I said about Leclerc not being perhaps as good as I first thought, that would be quite the pairing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, has any driver gone from Ferrari to Mercedes? Schumacher?
Not in recent history.
Yeah, not directly.
But Schumacher had a break right before. It would be an interesting one. He would be up there with people like Schumacher, but I'd argue they're a little bit different because I think Schumacher was brought on, and I could be wrong. There's going to be a stat man out there who will know.
I've thought of one. It's technically not that, but Mercedes used to be called Brawn, and Brawn used to be called Honda, and I think Rubens Barrichello went from Ferrari to Honda at some point.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. So it's not Ferrari to Mercedes, but it's technically because Honda used to be at the same factory that Mercedes are at now. But yeah.
Well, it would be an unusual move. Is what I'm going to say. Very rare, and Schumacher's the only one I think did do Mercedes and Ferrari as they are called. But there was a break in the middle, I think, and I think Schumacher was brought on to help develop the car. Anyway, I've digressed. Which is, to be honest, I think he needs a directive from Ferrari to say, look, you've got to stop pushing as hard. And I think it's on Ferrari now to deliver what they promised when they got rid of Mattia Binotto and ushered in what they were calling like a new era, Fred Vasseur in the leadership role, because they've got a car that's just a bit poor. And they're having to try and get their golden boy to get around the track faster than anyone else. And I just don't think it's going to work like that. I don't think Sainz is a better driver than Leclerc. I think Leclerc is still the ultimate talent. But I think his inconsistency, and I'm just being kind, I think, is due to the fact he's having to push so hard. Max was inconsistent in 2021. He got himself in poor pit situations. He crashed out. Managed to crash him and Hamilton out, multiple times. Twice I can think of the time when they came in and collided. I think the inconsistency here is a bit different to like Mick or Romain Grosjean, where they sort of crashed out on their own sort of mistakes because they were just being overambitious, a bit silly. I think Leclerc is having to push the car and is overcompensating for the lack of performance inherently in the Ferrari. Mick and Roman were crashing out, keeping the Haas a bit in its parameters, if you'd like. They were just silly mistakes. Whereas I think Leclerc's having to take more risks to try and get that glory. Maybe it would be good for him to go to Mercedes. That'd be great, but only time will tell.
And looking further down the pack now, we go to Alpine and Haas, who, after a quite chaotic qualifying, cashed in when it came to the race. You had Magnussen ending up in P4 on the Saturday, that is, and then falling down to P10, which is a point after a very good fight with Leclerc, who we just mentioned. And then going on to Alpine, you had Gasly qualifying in P5, falling down to P8. Meanwhile, Ocon falling down from P8 to P9, so double points finish for them. A good weekend for them. We're now looking at Alpine sort of solidifying, being in joint 5th with McLaren, and also Haas moving away from the bottom 3. They're now in 7th. Do you think they'll stay where they are, or is there chance for a bit of jeopardy, be that positive or negative from either?
Angus.
Alpine. Interesting. I like your phrasing, saying they solidify 5th, 6th place in the constructors there. Very interesting, considering what we heard from the CEO Laurent Rossi earlier this week, basically saying that if things don't improve, then heads may roll, and he wouldn't be afraid to do it before the end of the season. Big statement. So, yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. When Alpine had a strong year, Alpine, I can't lie, probably a bit annoyed right now, because firstly, their car isn't as quick. They are in a team where they were hoping to close the gap to the top 3 teams. They're currently 210 points off Red Bull. Not the best start. They've also their star driver and double world champion, who was welcomed back with open arms, ditched the team and is now racking up podiums in a rival who was a long way behind them up until the end of last year. Oh, and they lost their star protege as well to a direct rival. So it's not been the best year for Alpine. And I still don't doubt they've got a strong lineup in Gasly and Ocon. And the fact that they got a double points finish this weekend, that's a good thing. Second double points finish of the season. But at the same time, they're just not doing as well as they should be, I feel. I mean, yes, the car isn't as strong, but at the same time, when you build a car, you hope it doesn't set on fire like it did in Baku. When you build a car, you hope that your drivers don't crash into each other like they did in Australia. It's quite a sight seeing two very bright pink cars just in tatters on the side of the track in at Albert Park like they were. But they definitely I'd agree, definitely had a better weekend in Miami. The caveat of Gasly's P5 and Ocon's P8 in qualifying was the fact that Verstappen and Leclerc and Russell didn't have those chances, those better extra laps due to the situation with the red flag. Otherwise, that would have been possibly 7th and 8th or 8th and 9th or something like that. But at least that's a promising sign, I guess. And the points finishes is as well. But I'm not surprised that Mr. Rossi is a little bit peeved at the start of the season they've made and how they are closer to the bottom of the leaderboard than they are to anywhere near where they were last year. So, will heads roll? Will Otmar Safnauer be under intense pressure? From the sounds of it, the pressure's already started.
Yeah, but it's Rossi, Rossi, who was labelled as Alain Prost, world champion in Formula One, and I would say very methodical man, as pretty toxic human to work under, and not very liked either, as you can probably imagine by those comments from Prost there. But I don't think it's Otmar Safnauer's fault, most of this stuff. The car was being developed for he arrived. He would have looked at the legal team and trusted the legal team when it came to securing the contract for Piastri. So that's not really his fault either. He's only been there a few months, so blimey, I think that would be incredibly harsh to get rid of him. Maybe Laurent Rossi needs to leave because he's not doing very well. He's been CEO throughout all of this, so I can see why Renault is a bit annoyed, because they're throwing a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of engineers, a lot of effort at this, and they're not getting the performance that they thought they should or would. But then so are McLaren. McLaren are doing the same thing. I mean, I still find it a bit weird that they're with they've chucked the Alpine brand in there, because Renault's the one with all the pedigree, a really, really good pedigree. But that's for another time. If they got rid of Otmar now, it would be for the wrong reasons. They'll just Ferrari it. They've got to at least allow him to make his mark. But I'd be looking further up the chain, to be honest. Laurent Rossi, I think, is just a poor manager. There you go. I said it. If you're listening, Rossi, then hi. And I think fundamentally, they are right. They should be doing better with the resources they've got. But it's only the second season of new regulations. You can't expect miracles if you didn't get it right the first time, and they haven't got it right the first time. So just got to develop the car instead of moaning, I think.
There's always a psychodrama going on at Renault/Alpine, isn't there, seemingly? If it wasn't Daniel Ricciardo, then it was Oscar Piastri, it was Cyril Abiteboul, it was name anything, basically, in the recent iteration of the car here. And I think it would be, quite frankly, outrageous if Otmar Safnauer were to get sacked after their joint 5th in the Constructors' Championship. Yes, Aston Martin have jumped them, surprised everyone, I think, really, with how well they've done. But in my view, when it comes to Aston Martin, it's a castle built on sand. You've got a driver who's going to be retiring very shortly, and you've got the son of the owner who is, quite frankly, not fit to drive in that car because I don't think he's good enough. Meanwhile, compare that with Alpine, for example, 2 very solid drivers, both French in nationality, also not even reached their peak, really, when it comes to their age. I think the future's looking bright. And I mean, with McLaren, for example, you've got peaks and troughs there. Meanwhile, with Alpine, they seem to be rather consistent. So I'd be very happy with a P5, looking at how they've been previously, that is, when it comes to Renault/Alpine. Because if they ever struck me as a car or a constructor that wants to win championships, they're just very, very happy to be sort of 4th, 5th, the plucky underdogs getting in there occasionally, because they've got the money, they've got the resource. They quite happily say on Drive to Survive, oh, well, we are the biggest manufacturer of cars in France. We are just an amazing brand, but not, in my view anyway, willing to go and put their money where their mouth is or make ruthless decisions to go and win championships. So 5th is where they deserve to be, really, and I think 5th or 4th is probably where they'll stay if the current drivers and team stays in place, which honestly isn't really a bad thing, because you've got such a solidified, I suppose, out of reach almost top 3 in Red Bull, Mercedes and Ferrari. It's very, very hard to break into unless you've got plans to do so on a sustainable footing, which, irrespective of the Constructors' Championship I'm looking at now, I'm not convinced that Aston Martin have the ability to do that. So if you were to choose boom and bust versus strong and stable, I think I know which one I'd be going for. So calm. I would urge calm from the hierarchy at Alpine after a good weekend, really. It's the wrong words to say in bad optics after a good performance by both drivers. Well, on that note, that seems that's all we've got time for in terms of episode 12 of F1 in Review 2023. Thank you very much for listening all the way to the end of this one, be that on your preferred podcast provider or indeed elsewhere. A reminder, as ever, you can follow us on Twitter and TikTok, the handle being F1 in Review, all one word, of course. And unfortunately, there's no racing this coming weekend. The next Grand Prix is Imola. That is on May the 21st, but we'll return next week to dissect the losers from the Miami Grand Prix and talk about other things when it comes to Formula 1 news, opinions and elsewhere. So we'll be back next week. Do tune in, and we look forward to having your company again. See you later. Bye-bye.